cruel millionaire forced his cleaner to sing at a luxury party to humiliate her. However, when she started singing, everyone was left speechless. Lila Barrett stood in front of the bathroom mirror, her reflection illuminated by the flickering fluorescent light. She adjusted the plain gray uniform she wore every day as a cleaner in the sprawling Sinclair mansion. The uniform's stiff fabric itched against her skin, a small but constant reminder of the life she led. She tied her thick brown hair into a loose bun, her hands moving mechanically as her mind wandered to the day ahead. The routine was the same: scrub floors, polish windows, dust antiques that cost more than she made in a year. The mansion itself was a study in excess, from the grand marble staircase that twisted through the foyer to the crystal chandeliers that seemed to drip from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. Every corner of the house screamed wealth, yet, to Lila, it was cold and lifeless, a gilded cage where she spent hours trying to remain invisible. She sighed as she slipped her feet into worn sneakers. The soles were thin, but she couldn't afford to replace them just yet. Every penny she earned went toward supporting her two younger brothers, now teenagers, back in the small apartment they shared in Chicago's South Side. Since their mother's passing years ago, Lila had assumed the role of caretaker. Dreams of becoming a singer, of using the voice everyone once told her was a gift, had been packed away, gathering dust like the corners of the mansion she cleaned. "Lila," Mrs. Rodriguez's warm voice broke through her thoughts. "Are you done in there? Everett's party planner is already barking orders." "I'm coming," Lila called back, grabbing her cleaning supplies. Mrs. Rodriguez, the mansion's head cook, was a kind woman who had taken Lila under her wing when she first started working at the Sinclair estate. As Lila stepped into the kitchen, she was greeted by the comforting aroma of fresh bread and roasted garlic. For a moment, the warmth in the kitchen felt like a haven, a stark contrast to the rest of the mansion. "You've got to be careful today," Mrs. Rodriguez warned as she kneaded dough with practiced ease. "Everett's in one of his moods," Lila nodded, already anticipating the sharp words and icy glares of her employer. Everett Sinclair was the epitome of arrogance, a man whose wealth seemed to amplify his disdain for those he deemed beneath him. And in his eyes, that included nearly everyone. The sound of approaching footsteps, brisk and deliberate, echoed through the kitchen. Everett appeared in the doorway, dressed in a tailored suit that likely cost more than Lila's annual salary. His sharp features were accentuated by a perpetual scowl. "You," he said, pointing at Lila without so much as glancing at her directly. "The grand ballroom looks like a disaster. Handle it." "Yes, Mr. Sinclair," Lila replied, lowering her gaze. "And make it quick," he added, his tone dripping with condescension. "Some of us have important guests arriving tonight." With that, he turned on his heel and left, his presence leaving a chill in the air. Mrs. Rodriguez shot Lila a sympathetic glance. "Don't let him get to you, mija. People like him, they're all talk, no substance." Lila mustered a weak smile and made her way to the grand ballroom. The space was as imposing as the rest of the mansion, with vaulted ceilings painted in intricate gold leaf designs and massive windows overlooking the manicured gardens. As Lila worked, scrubbing the floors on her hands and knees, she couldn't help but hum softly. It was a habit, a way to make the time pass. Her voice filled the empty room, rich and melodic, echoing off the marble walls. "Not bad," a voice interrupted her reverie. Startled, Lila turned to see Everett standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps. "Don't stop on my account," he said, stepping into the room. "It's just surprising to hear something decent come out of someone like you." Heat rose to Lila's cheeks, a mix of embarrassment and anger. She swallowed her retort, focusing instead on the cleaning rag in her hand. "I have an idea," Everett continued, a smirk playing on his lips. "You'll perform at the party tonight. A little entertainment for my guests." Lila froze. "Perform?" "Yes, sing. Show my guests how the lower class entertains the rich," he said with mockery. "It'll be amusing." Her chest tightened. Singing was a part of her she'd buried long ago, and the thought of reviving it, especially as a joke for Everett's elite crowd, filled her with dread. I don't think I can," she stammered. Everett waved a dismissive hand. It wasn't a request, before she could respond. He walked out, leaving her standing alone in the grand ballroom, the weight of his words sinking in. She gripped the rag tightly, her mind swirling with emotions. For years she had silenced her voice, but now it seemed fate, or perhaps cruelty, was demanding she find it again. The morning sun filtered through the mansion's tall, arched windows, casting golden streaks on the polished marble floors. Lila's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the cleaning bucket, replaying Everett's words from the day before. "Show my guests how the lower class entertains the rich." The words stung, but she knew refusing wasn't an option. "Lila, you okay?" Mrs. Rodriguez's voice pulled her from her thoughts. The older woman was slicing a mountain of vegetables in the kitchen, her movements quick and precise. Lila hesitated before answering. "He wants me to sing at the party tonight." Mrs. Rodriguez's hands froze mid-chop, her eyes narrowed. "What?" "He said it wasn't a request," Lila added, her voice barely above a whisper. The older woman muttered something in Spanish, her tone a mix of anger and disbelief. "That man, always using people for his little games. Are you going to do it?" "I don't know," Lila admitted. "If I say no, I'll lose my job. But if I say yes..." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Mrs. Rodriguez wiped her hands on her apron and turned to Lila, her expression softening. "Mija, you have a gift. If you're going to sing, don't let it be for him. Let it be for you. Remind yourself of who you are." Lila nodded, but the knot in her stomach remained. Singing wasn't just something she'd stopped doing. It was something she had buried. The memories tied to her voice were too painful, tangled in the grief of losing her mother, and the dreams she'd sacrificed to keep her family together. As the day went on, the mansion buzzed with activity. Caterers, florists, and event planners moved about, arranging every detail of the evening's extravagant party. Lila did her best to stay out of sight, focusing on her tasks and avoiding Everett's critical eye. She wasn't successful. "Lila!" Everett's voice rang out sharply from across the foyer. He strode toward her, his expression a mix of impatience and disdain. "Have you selected something appropriate to wear tonight?" Lila blinked. I don't have anything." He sighed dramatically, as though her lack of preparation was a personal affront. "Of course you don't. Ask someone on staff to lend you something. I expect you to look presentable." "Yes, Mr. Sinclair," she replied, her jaw tightening as he walked away. She couldn't help but notice the way everyone in his path seemed to shrink, as though his presence drained the room of warmth. Everett Sinclair was a man who thrived on power, and he wielded it with calculated cruelty. Later that afternoon, Lila found herself in the small staff quarters, where Mrs. Rodriguez held up a simple navy blue dress. "It's not fancy, but it'll do, and it's clean," she said, handing it to Lila. The dress was modest, with a high neckline and a hem that reached just below the knees. It wasn't anything like the designer gowns the party guests would wear, but it fit well enough, and for that, Lila was grateful. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely steady. Mrs. Rodriguez placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're going to be amazing, Mija. Don't let them see your fear. Let them see your strength." The evening arrived faster than Lila had anticipated. The mansion, now glowing with hundreds of lights, looked like something out of a fairy tale. Guests in glittering gowns and tailored suits filled the grand ballroom, their laughter and chatter echoing through the vast space. Lila stood near the edge of the room, clutching a microphone. Her palms were damp, and her heart raced as she scanned the crowd. She could feel their eyes on her, their curiosity tinged with judgment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Everett's smooth, commanding voice silenced the room. He stood at the center of the ballroom, holding a champagne flute as though he were conducting a symphony. "Tonight, we have a special treat for you." His gaze found Lila, and he smiled, a cold, predatory expression. "One of our very own staff members, Miss Lila Barrett, will be entertaining us with her lovely voice. Please, show her your appreciation." The applause that followed was polite but lacked sincerity. Lila's stomach churned as she stepped forward. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to stand her ground as she raised the microphone to her lips. A wave of silence washed over the room. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The memory of her mother's gentle encouragement filled her mind. "Sing like no one is watching, Lila." The first note came out soft and shaky, But as she continued, her voice grew stronger, richer. The melody carried through the room, weaving its way into the hearts of the listeners. Lila's fear melted away, replaced by something she hadn't felt in years: freedom. When she opened her eyes, she was met with an unexpected sight. The room, which had been filled with skepticism and judgment, now seemed transfixed. Even Everett, who had expected to humiliate her, looked momentarily stunned. As the song ended, a heavy silence hung in the air before the applause erupted. Lila blinked, struggling to process the shift in the room's energy. She had come expecting ridicule, but had instead found something entirely different: respect. She stepped off the stage, her knees trembling. Mrs. Rodriguez caught her in the hallway, a proud smile on her face. "What did I tell you? Mija, you showed them." But before Lila could respond, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see a man in an impeccably tailored suit. "Michael Porter," he said, extending a hand. "I'd like to talk to you about your future." Lila's heart skipped a beat. Lila sat in the dimly lit staff quarters, staring at her hands, still trembling from the events of the previous evening. The simple navy blue dress hung on a hook nearby, a quiet reminder of the surreal turn her life had taken. Michael Porter's words echoed in her mind. "I'd like to talk to you about your future." Her future. The idea seemed absurd. For years, her only goal had been survival, working hard to keep a roof over her brothers' heads and food on the table. Dreams like singing on a stage or recording an album had been filed away under impossible. Yet, for the first time in years, a door had opened, and it scared her as much as it intrigued her. "Lila, you're going to wear a hole in the floor if you keep pacing like that," Mrs. Rodriguez said, breaking the silence. The older woman leaned against the counter, peeling potatoes for the day's lunch service. "I don't know what to do," Lila admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Rodriguez set down her knife and looked at her. "Mija, opportunities like this don't come around every day. You have to at least hear him out. But what if I fail? What if this is all just some cruel joke?" Lila asked, the weight of her insecurities pressing down on her. Mrs. Rodriguez walked over and placed a firm hand on Lila's shoulder. "You've already proven you're stronger than you think last night. You made them listen, and if you can do that, you can do anything." Lila nodded, though doubt still lingered in the corners of her mind. She hadn't even decided if she'd call Michael back. The business card he had handed her sat in her pocket, a tangible piece of a reality she wasn't sure she was ready to face. By late afternoon, Lila found herself back in the grand ballroom, this time scrubbing the edges of the floor where the vacuum couldn't reach. The remnants of last night's glamour were gone, replaced by the quiet emptiness that usually filled the house. "Miss Barrett." Everett's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Lila sat up quickly, turning to face him. He stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Yes, Mr. Sinclair?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He strode into the room, his footsteps echoing ominously. "I've been informed that you were approached by a guest last night, a producer." Lila's heart raced. "Yes, sir." Everett's lips curled into something that was almost a smile but lacked any warmth. "And have you considered what you're going to do with this opportunity?" "I'm still deciding," she replied cautiously. "Well, let me make something clear," he said, his tone hardening. "You're under my employ. Any ventures you pursue will need to be discussed with me first. Do you understand?" Lila clenched her fists at her sides. "With all due respect, sir, my personal decisions are my own." Everett's smile vanished. He stepped closer, his imposing figure towering over her. "You seem to forget your place, Miss Barrett. Don't make the mistake of thinking last night changes anything. You're still just the help." The words stung, but Lila forced herself to stand tall. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her, if that's all. "Mr. Sinclair, I have work to do," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Everett stared at her for a moment longer before turning on his heel and leaving the room. As the door closed behind him, Lila let out a shaky breath. She couldn't let him control her. Not anymore, that evening. Back at her small apartment, Lila sat at the kitchen table staring at the card in her hand. Her brothers, James and Daniel, were finishing their homework nearby, their quiet chatter filling the room. "Are you going to call him?" James asked, glancing at her. "Call who?" Lila asked, startled. "The guy from the party?" "The one who gave you the card," he said, nodding toward her hand. Lila hesitated. "I don't know. It's a big decision." "You should do it," Daniel chimed in, not looking up from his textbook. "Why are you both so sure?" she asked, surprised by their confidence. James shrugged. "Because you deserve something good for a change." Lila's chest tightened. Her brother's faith in her was overwhelming. She had spent so much of her life taking care of them, and now, it seemed, they were the ones encouraging her. With a deep breath, she picked up her phone and dialed the number on the card. After a few rings, a warm, professional voice answered. "Michael Porter." "Hi. Mr. Porter, this is Lila Barrett," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Lila, I'm so glad you called. I've been hoping to hear from you," he said enthusiastically. "I've been thinking about your offer," she began, her words careful. "And," Michael prompted, "I'd like to know more," she said, her heart pounding in her chest. "Great. Let's meet tomorrow. I'll explain everything and answer any questions you have. Trust me, Lila. This could change your life," Michael said confidently, as Lila hung up. A mix of fear and excitement coursed through her. The door to a new chapter of her life had just creaked open, and she was finally ready to step through. The next day felt like a blur. Lila spent most of it juggling her usual cleaning tasks while trying to ignore the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. The meeting with Michael Porter was scheduled for late in the afternoon. Just before the start of her evening shift, she wasn't sure what to expect, too. But the possibility of something new, something bigger than her current life, kept her nerves buzzing. By 4:30 p.m., Lila found herself sitting in a cozy downtown cafe, her hands wrapped tightly around a warm mug of tea. Michael Porter arrived right on time, exuding a mix of professionalism and warmth that immediately put her at ease. "Lila," he said, smiling as he sat down. "Thanks for meeting me." "Thank you for inviting me," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Over the next hour, Michael explained his vision, an opportunity to record a demo and potentially work with his team to launch a music career. Lila listened intently, her initial skepticism giving way to cautious optimism. "What do you think?" Michael asked, leaning forward. "I think it sounds amazing," Lila admitted. "But I have responsibilities, my brothers. My job. It's not just about me." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "I understand, and I respect that, but Lila, you have a gift. Don't let it go to waste. We'll work around your schedule and ease into this. Take it one step at a time." His words lingered in her mind as she made her way back to the Sinclair mansion. By the time she arrived, the party preparations were in full swing. The staff buzzed around the grand ballroom. Adding final touches to the decor, Lila slipped into the kitchen, where Mrs. Rodriguez was overseeing the last of the hors d'oeuvres. "How'd it go?" the older woman asked, her sharp eyes catching Lila's flushed face. "Good," Lila replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Really good." Mrs. Rodriguez grinned. "I knew it now. Focus on tonight. You've got this." By the time the guests began arriving, the mansion had been transformed into a glittering spectacle. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting a warm glow over the room. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne flutes and delicate canapes. Lila, dressed once again in the navy blue dress, stood near the entrance, trying to steady her breathing. Everett appeared beside her, his presence as cold and commanding as ever. "Don't embarrass me," he said in a low voice, his eyes scanning the room. "I'll do my best, Mr. Sinclair," Lila replied evenly. His lips curled into a thin smile. "See that you do." As the evening progressed, Lila found herself blending into the background, observing the opulence around her. Guests laughed and sipped their drinks, their conversations filled with the ease of people who had never worried about making ends meet. Lila couldn't help but feel like an outsider. Even as she prepared herself for the moment she would take the stage, the announcement came just before the dinner service. Everett raised a hand, commanding the attention of the room. The chatter died down as the spotlight shifted to him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. "Tonight, I have a special treat for you all. One of our very own staff members, Miss Lila Barrett, will be performing for us, please. Show her your appreciation." The polite applause that followed was laced with curiosity and a hint of condescension. Lila took a deep breath as she stepped onto the small stage. the microphone feeling heavy in her hand. The room seemed impossibly large, the faces in the crowd blurring together. Closing her eyes, she recalled her mother's voice, warm and encouraging. "Sing with your heart, Lila. Let them feel it." The first note escaped her lips, soft and hesitant. But as she continued, as her voice grew stronger, filling the space with a rich, soulful melody, the room fell silent, the conversations and clinking glasses fading away. Lila's voice wrapped around the audience, pulling them into her world, her story. Each word, each note, carried years of pain, hope, and resilience when she opened her eyes. She was met with an unexpected sight, tears glistening in the eyes of some guests. A collective sense of awe painted across their faces. Even Everett, standing off to the side, looked momentarily stunned. The song ended, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, the applause erupted, louder and more genuine than anything Lila had expected. A wave of emotion crashed over her as she stepped off the stage, her legs trembling. In the hallway, Mrs. Rodriguez was waiting, her eyes shining with pride. "I told you," she said, pulling Lila into a tight hug. "You're incredible." Before Lila could respond, a familiar voice called her name. She turned to see Michael Porter, his expression one of excitement. "Lila, that was extraordinary," he said. "We need to start working together immediately. Your voice deserves to be heard." Lila's heart raced. For the first time in years, she felt like her dreams weren't just distant whispers. They were within reach. The applause from the ballroom still echoed in Lila's ears as she stood outside the grand hall. Michael Porter's words ringing in her mind. "Your voice deserves to be heard." For a moment, she struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what he was offering. Her voice, something she had buried so deep, was now opening doors she never imagined possible. "Lila," Michael prompted, his eyes kind yet eager. "What do you think?" She started, her voice faltering. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he said simply, a warm smile spreading across his face. "We can work out the details, but talent like yours, it's rare, Lila. And I don't just mean your voice. I mean the way you connect with people. It's authentic." Lila felt a lump in her throat, a mix of excitement and fear. "I have responsibilities, my brothers. My job." "Of course," Michael interrupted gently. "I'm not asking you to drop everything overnight. This can be gradual, on your terms. All I ask is that you give yourself this chance." She hesitated, her mind racing. Could she balance this opportunity with the life she'd built for her family? Before she could answer, Everett's sharp voice cut through the moment. "Miss Barrett?" He approached from the hallway, his expression unreadable. "A word." Lila stiffened, giving Michael an apologetic glance. "Excuse me." Everett motioned for her to follow him to a quieter corner of the house. As soon as they were alone, his demeanor turned cold. "What exactly are you doing?" "I'm not sure I understand, Mr. Sinclair," Lila replied, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I saw you talking to that producer," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "I hope you're not foolish enough to think this changes anything." Lila's heart pounded. "With all due respect, sir, what I do outside of my duties here is my own business." Everett's eyes narrowed. "Don't forget your place, Miss Barrett. Whatever fantasies you're entertaining, remember that you're still an employee under my roof." The word stung, but Lila forced herself to remain calm. "If that's all, sir, I need to get back to work." Everett lingered for a moment, his glare icy. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Lila let out a shaky breath, her emotions swirling. Part of her wanted to cry, but another part, a stronger part, felt a flicker of defiance. For years, she had stayed in her place, but maybe it was time to step out of it. By the time Lila returned to her small apartment that night, exhaustion weighed on her shoulders. Her brothers, James and Daniel, were sprawled on the couch, engrossed in a movie. "How was the party?" James asked without looking away from the screen. "Complicated," Lila replied, setting her bag down and sinking into a chair. But something unexpected happened. Daniel muted the TV and turned to her, his curiosity piqued. "What kind of unexpected?" "A producer wants to work with me," she admitted, the words still feeling surreal. Both boys stared at her, their jaws dropping simultaneously. "Wait, what?" James finally said, sitting up straight. "Michael Porter. He's a big name in the music industry. He heard me sing and said I have potential," Lila explained. "That's amazing," Daniel exclaimed. "So, what's the plan?" "I don't know yet," Lila said honestly. "I want to do it, but I'm scared. What if I can't balance everything? What if I fail?" James scoffed. "You won't fail, Lila. You've taken care of us all these years. You're the strongest person we know." Daniel nodded in agreement. "And you've always told us to follow our dreams. It's your turn now." Lila felt a surge of emotion at their words. She had spent so much time being their protector, their anchor, that she hadn't realized how much they believed in her. "Thanks, guys," she said, her voice thick with gratitude. "I'll think about it." The following morning, Lila called Michael and agreed to meet with him again to discuss next steps. They arranged for her to visit his studio the next week, a prospect that both excited and terrified her. As she hung up the phone, a small smile crept onto her face. For the first time in years, she felt like she was moving toward something instead of just surviving. At the mansion, however, Everett's mood was noticeably colder. He watched Lila from a distance, his calculating gaze following her every move. It was clear he wasn't pleased with the attention she had received at the party, and she braced herself for whatever he might throw her way by mid-afternoon. Mrs. Rodriguez pulled her aside in the kitchen. "Are you okay, mija? You've been quiet today." "Everett's been watching me," Lila admitted. "I think he's trying to intimidate me." Mrs. Rodriguez sighed, her expression hardening. "That man thrives on control. Don't let him scare you. You have every right to chase your dreams." Lila nodded, taking comfort in the older woman's support. She knew Everett wouldn't make things easy, but she also knew she couldn't let him stand in her way. That evening, as Lila walked home, the city lights twinkled against the dark sky. Her mind wandered to the possibilities ahead. The studio session, the chance to share her music, the hope of building a new life for her family. For so long, she had put everyone else first, burying her own dreams under the weight of responsibility. But now, with a glimmer of opportunity before her, she felt something stir inside her, a spark of determination. She wasn't just doing this for herself. She was doing it for her brothers, for her mother's memory, and for the life she knew they all deserved. The sun peeked through the thin curtains of Lila's bedroom, casting a warm glow on the modest furnishings. She stretched lazily, a rare sense of optimism stirring within her. Today marked the beginning of something new, a tentative step toward a dream she had long abandoned. She was meeting Michael at his studio to discuss recording her first demo. Down the hall, she could hear the familiar sounds of her brothers getting ready for school. The clatter of dishes and muffled laughter brought a smile to her face. Pulling herself out of bed, she joined them in the small kitchen. "Morning, sleepyhead," James teased, sliding a plate of toast toward her. "Look who's talking," she shot back with a grin. "You're usually the last one up." Daniel poured himself a glass of orange juice. "So, big day today, right?" Lila nodded, her stomach fluttering with a mix of excitement and nerves. "Yeah, meeting Michael at the studio." James leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with encouragement. "You're gonna crush it." "Thanks," she said softly, grateful for their unwavering support. "I just hope I can balance everything." Daniel shrugged. "We can help out more around here. Don't worry about us." Emotion welled up in her chest. "You two are the best, you know that." "Obviously," James said with a mock hair flip, eliciting a laugh from all of them. Later that morning, Lila stood outside a sleek building downtown, the name Porter Productions emblazoned on the glass doors. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside, immediately greeted by a friendly receptionist who directed her to the third floor. As the elevator doors opened, Michael was there to meet her. "Lila, right on time, come on in." He led her through a maze of hallways until they reached a spacious recording studio. The room was a blend of modern technology and cozy aesthetics. Plush couches, ambient lighting, and state-of-the-art equipment. "Wow," Lila whispered, taking it all in. "Impressive, isn't it?" Michael said, watching her reaction. "This is where the magic happens." They spent the next hour discussing her musical style, influences, and potential directions for her sound. Michael's genuine interest and professional insights put her at ease. He wasn't just offering her a chance. He was investing in her as an artist. "Ready to give it a try?" he asked, gesturing toward the sound booth. Her heart skipped a beat. "Now. No time like the present," he said with an encouraging smile. Lila nodded, swallowing her nerves. She stepped into the booth, the microphone standing tall before her. Adjusting the headphones, she glanced through the glass window where Michael gave her a thumbs up. The instrumental track began to play, a soulful melody that resonated with her. Closing her eyes, she let the music wash over her, drawing from deep within as she began to sing. Her voice flowed effortlessly, weaving emotion into every note. When the song ended, she opened her eyes to see Michael grinning widely. "That was incredible, Lila. Truly." She stepped out of the booth, a flush of pride warming her cheeks. "Thank you, it felt right. We've got something special here," he said, already jotting down notes. "I can't wait to see where this goes." Over the next few weeks, Lila found herself juggling her duties at the mansion, her responsibilities at home, and her burgeoning music career. It was exhausting, but exhilarating. She coordinated her recording sessions around her work schedule, often staying up late into the night to rehearse. At the mansion, Everett's demeanor grew increasingly hostile. He would assign her extra tasks, criticize her work without cause, and make snide remarks within earshot. It was clear he was aware of her activities outside of work and disapproved. One afternoon, as she was polishing the banister of the grand staircase, Everett approached her with a cold smirk. "I trust you're not letting extracurricular distractions interfere with your duties here." She met his gaze evenly. "I assure you, my work remains a priority." "See that it does," he replied sharply. "I'd hate to have to find a replacement." Lila forced a polite smile. "Understood, Mr. Sinclair." As he walked away, Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at the bottom of the stairs. "Don't mind him, mija. He's just threatened by anyone who dares to rise above." "I know," Lila sighed. "But it's like he's determined to make this as difficult as possible." Mrs. Rodriguez patted her hand. "Keep your head up. You have a gift, and no one can take that from you." At home, her brothers did their best to lighten her load. James took on extra chores, while Daniel started cooking simple meals to ensure Lila had time to rest and practice. One evening, they surprised her with a small celebration. As she walked through the door, the scent of spaghetti filled the air, and a homemade banner reading "Congrats, Lila" hung crookedly across the living room. "What's all this?" she asked, touched. "We heard your first single is almost finished," Daniel said, handing her a plate. "Figured we should celebrate." Tears prickled at the corners of her eyes. "You guys didn't have to do this." "Of course we did," James insisted. "We're proud of you." They sat together, laughter and stories filling the room. For a moment, the pressures of the outside world faded, replaced by the simple joy of family. But not everyone shared in her happiness. At work, Everett's sabotage escalated. He began questioning her performance, setting unrealistic expectations, and even hinting at termination. Lila knew she was walking a tightrope. One day, Michael called with exciting news. "Lila, the demo has caught the attention of several labels. They want to meet you." "That's amazing," she exclaimed, her heart soaring. "But there's a showcase next week, and they'll be there. It's short notice, but this could be your big break." Lila hesitated. "I'll need to adjust my work schedule. I'm not sure if... Is there any way you can make it happen?" Michael pressed gently. Opportunities like this are rare. Determination settled within her. "I'll be there." That evening, Lila approached Everett in his study, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She knocked lightly on the open door. He glanced up, annoyance flickering across his face. "What is it?" "I wanted to request time off next week," she began cautiously. "Just for a couple of days." He leaned back in his chair, eyeing her suspiciously. "And why would I approve that?" "I have an important personal commitment," she said, choosing her words carefully. Everett smirked. "Let me guess. More singing nonsense." She squared her shoulders. "Yes, it's an opportunity I can't afford to miss." He stood up, slowly walking around the desk to stand before her. "Miss Barrett, your priorities seem misplaced. You're needed here." "I've always fulfilled my duties," she replied, her voice steady. "But I need this time." He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Request denied." Lila felt a surge of frustration. "May I ask why?" Because I won't have my staff gallivanting off on frivolous pursuits, he said coldly. Now, if that's all, you're dismissed. Her hands clenched at her sides. Very well. As she turned to leave, his parting words lingered ominously. Consider your position here carefully, Miss Barrett. Choices have consequences. Back at home, Lila relayed the situation to her brothers. He refused to give me the time off. Then quit, James said bluntly. She looked at him, surprised. I can't just quit. We need the income. We'll manage, Daniel insisted. This is your dream, Lila. Don't let him control you. She sat down, weighing her options. Could she risk it? After a moment, she looked up, resolve hardening in her eyes. You're right. It's time I took control of my own life. The days leading up to the showcase were a whirlwind of rehearsals, planning, and quiet moments of doubt. Lila spent every spare minute perfecting her performance, knowing this was her chance to show the world what she could do. At the same time, Everett's relentless interference at work only added to her stress. Each morning, she walked into the mansion bracing for whatever new obstacles Everett would throw her way. From unreasonably demanding cleaning schedules to last-minute changes in assignments, his tactics were becoming increasingly transparent, yet Lila refused to let him see her falter. One afternoon, while polishing the chandelier in the grand ballroom, Everett approached with his usual air of superiority. Miss Barrett, he began, his voice laced with condescension. I noticed the dining room floor wasn't spotless yesterday. Care to explain? Lila turned to face him, keeping her expression neutral. I wasn't assigned to the dining room yesterday, Mr. Sinclair. Perhaps you should ask Henry. Everett's eyes narrowed. Excuses don't suit you. Fix it before the guests arrive tonight. Yes, sir, she replied, her tone betraying none of the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. As he walked away, Mrs. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. That man is insufferable, she muttered, shaking her head. Don't let him get to you, mija, Lila sighed. He's just trying to make me quit. And you're not going to, Mrs. Rodriguez said firmly. You're stronger than he is. Later that evening, as Lila packed up to leave, she received a call from Michael. Hey, Lila, just wanted to check in. How's everything going? Good, she lied, glancing at the cleaning supplies in her hand. I'm ready for the showcase. Great to hear, Michael said. The labels are excited to meet you, remember? This is your moment, own it. His words were reassuring. But as Lila walked home, doubts crept in. Was she truly ready? Would the industry accept someone like her, with no formal training or connections? The thought of failure loomed large, but she reminded herself why she was doing this. Not just for herself, but for her brothers, and the dreams she had long set aside. The morning of the showcase arrived with a mix of nerves and excitement. Lila stood in front of the small mirror in her bedroom, carefully applying makeup and styling her hair. Her brothers hovered nearby, offering unhelpful but endearing advice. Try not to overthink it, James said, leaning against the doorframe. Just go out there and do what you do best. Yeah, and don't let those fancy people intimidate you, Daniel added. You've got this. Lila smiled at their attempts to encourage her. Thanks, guys, I'll do my best. As she grabbed her bag and headed for the door, James called out, Break a leg! The venue for the showcase was a sleek, upscale theater in the heart of the city. The stage, framed by elegant curtains, felt both intimidating and exhilarating. As Lila stepped inside, she was greeted by Michael, who looked every bit the seasoned producer in his tailored blazer. You made it, he said, beaming. Come on, let's get you warmed up. He led her backstage, where a small group of other performers was gathered. Some glanced her way with polite smiles, while others seemed absorbed in their own pre-performance rituals. Lila found a quiet corner to prepare, focusing on steadying her breathing and calming her nerves. Just remember, Michael said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You belong here. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Lila nodded, her confidence bolstered by his support. When her name was called, she stepped onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding her. The audience, a mix of music executives, industry professionals, and other performers, waited in hushed anticipation. She gripped the microphone tightly, her heart pounding. Taking a deep breath, she began to sing, The first notes wavered slightly, but as the melody unfolded, her voice grew stronger, filling the theater with emotion. The lyrics, raw and personal, seemed to resonate with the audience. She closed her eyes, pouring everything she had into the performance. When the song ended, the room erupted into applause. Lila opened her eyes, scanning the crowd. Among the applause, she caught glimpses of people nodding appreciatively and whispering to one another. Relief and pride washed over her as she stepped off the stage. Backstage, Michael was waiting with a wide grin. "Lila, you were phenomenal. They loved you." "Really?" she asked, still processing the moment. "Absolutely. A few labels have already expressed interest. This is just the beginning," he said, handing her a bottle of water. Lila took a sip, her hands still trembling slightly. "I can't believe this is happening," Michael laughed. "Believe it, Lila. You're on your way." As she left the theater that evening, her phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Rodriguez. "Proud of you, mija. Don't let anyone dim your light." Lila smiled, clutching her phone tightly for the first time in years. She felt like she was stepping into a future that was truly hers, but the victory was bittersweet. She knew Everett wouldn't take her success lightly. The thought of returning to the mansion, where his oppressive control loomed, dampened her excitement. Still, she resolved to face whatever came her way. "He can try to hold me back," she thought, "but he can't stop me." Lila woke the next morning with the lingering high of the showcase still warming her thoughts. Her performance had been everything she'd hoped for, and the feedback from Michael and the music executives felt surreal. Yet, as she tied her apron and prepared for another shift at the Sinclair mansion, the reality of her other life weighed heavily on her shoulders. The familiar walk to the mansion felt longer than usual. The city buzzed around her, alive with possibilities, but Lila couldn't shake the sense of dread she felt about facing Everett. His cold glares and sharp words had only intensified since her singing had garnered attention. Now, with her first big success under her belt, she knew he'd likely double his efforts to make her feel small. The day began uneventfully enough. Lila focused on her tasks, scrubbing floors and dusting furniture with the precision Everett demanded. She kept her head down, determined not to draw unnecessary attention. By mid-morning, Everett entered the kitchen, his presence a cold wind that silenced the chatter among the staff. He spotted Lila near the sink and walked over, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. "Miss Barrett," he said curtly. "Yes, Mr. Sinclair," she replied, keeping her voice neutral. "I understand you were absent yesterday evening," he began, his tone sharp. "I trust you had a valid reason." "I had a personal commitment," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "A personal commitment," he repeated, his lip curling. "And what, pray tell, was so important that you couldn't fulfill your duties here?" Lila hesitated. She could feel the other staff members watching, their eyes flitting nervously between her and Everett. "I had a music showcase," she admitted, her voice steady despite the tension. Everett's eyebrows lifted in mock surprise. "Ah, the little singer chasing dreams," he said with a cruel smirk. "I wonder, Miss Barrett, do you really believe this hobby of yours is worth risking your livelihood?" Lila felt her cheeks flush, but she refused to look away. "It's more than a hobby," she said firmly. "It's my future." The room fell silent. Everett's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. "Your future is here. Under my employ, I suggest you remember that." With that, he turned and strode out of the room, leaving a chill in his wake. Mrs. Rodriguez approached, placing a hand on Lila's arm. "Don't let him scare you, Mija. He sees your potential, and it terrifies him." Lila nodded, but Everett's words lingered in her mind. For years, she had let people like him define her limits. Now, she was determined to break free. That evening, as Lila walked home, her phone buzzed with a call from Michael. "Hey, Lila, how are you feeling after the showcase?" "I'm still processing everything," she admitted. "It was incredible." "Well, buckle up," Michael said, excitement in his voice. "One of the labels we spoke with wants to meet you next week. They're interested in signing you." Lila stopped in her tracks, her heart racing. "Are you serious?" "Completely," Michael replied. "This is huge, Lila. It's a chance to take things to the next level." Her mind raced with possibilities. But a flicker of doubt crept in. "What if I'm not ready?" Michael's tone softened. Lila, you're ready, trust me. This is your time. She let out a shaky breath. Okay, let's do it. The following week, Lila found herself in a sleek conference room overlooking the city skyline. Across the table sat representatives from one of the industry's top music labels. Michael had prepped her thoroughly, but the weight of the moment was undeniable. So, Lila, one of the executives began, we were very impressed with your showcase. Your voice is raw, emotive, and powerful. We'd like to offer you a contract. Lila's breath caught. She glanced at Michael, who gave her an encouraging nod. Thank you, she said, her voice trembling slightly. This means so much to me. The meeting continued with discussions of terms, expectations, and plans for her first album. By the time it ended, Lila felt like she was floating. The dream she'd once thought impossible was becoming a reality. When she returned to the mansion the next day, Lila couldn't hide the small smile on her face. She tackled her tasks with a newfound energy, even as Everett's sharp comments tried to pierce her joy. By mid-afternoon, Everett cornered her in the grand hallway. Miss Barrett, I've noticed a certain arrogance in your demeanor lately, he said, his tone icy. Lila straightened, meeting his gaze. I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. Sinclair. Don't play coy, he snapped. You think a few songs and some applause make you better than this job? Her hands clenched at her sides, but she kept her voice calm. I've always done my best here, sir, but yes, I'm proud of what I've accomplished outside of this job. Everett's eyes narrowed. Don't forget who you are, Miss Barrett. I haven't, she replied evenly, and I won't let anyone define that for me. The tension between them crackled, but this time, Lila didn't back down. Everett stared at her for a long moment before turning and walking away, his frustration palpable that night. Lila sat at the kitchen table with her brothers, recounting the meeting with the label. James grinned. I told you. You're unstoppable. Daniel nodded. And now Sinclair's just mad he can't control you anymore. Lila smiled, their words bolstering her resolve. I'm not afraid of him, not anymore. As she went to bed, her thoughts drifted to the future. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it head-on. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the mansion's grand windows, casting soft golden hues across the pristine floors. Lila arrived early, eager to keep herself busy and avoid Everett's scrutinizing presence. Yet, as she dusted the bookshelves in the study, her mind kept drifting to the events of the past weeks. The label meeting, the showcase, and her growing confidence all felt surreal, like pieces of a life she hadn't dared to imagine before. As she worked, her hand brushed against an ornate leather-bound book. It slipped off the shelf, landing with a thud on the floor. Careful, Lila, she muttered under her breath, crouching to pick it up. But as she did, something caught her eye. A small photograph, worn and creased with age, had slipped out from between the pages. Lila froze, staring at the image. It was a black-and-white snapshot of a younger Everett standing beside a woman she didn't recognize. The woman's face was kind, her smile radiant. Yet, what stood out most was the necklace she wore, a simple chain with a pendant shaped like a treble clef. Lila's breath caught in her throat. The pendant was eerily similar to one her mother had owned, a cherished piece that had gone missing after her mother's tragic death. What's this doing here? She whispered, her mind racing. Her heart pounded as she carefully slipped the photo back into the book and replaced it on the shelf. She couldn't shake the feeling that this discovery wasn't a coincidence. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Lila couldn't stop replaying the image of the woman in the pendant. Could there be a connection between Everett and her family? It seemed impossible, yet the thought nagged at her. That evening, as she walked home, the bustling streets of Chicago felt unusually quiet. Her thoughts were loud enough to drown out the noise. When she arrived at her apartment, James and Daniel were already at the table. Eating pizza? You okay? James asked, noting her distracted expression. Yeah, she said, though her voice betrayed her unease. She hesitated before speaking again. Do you guys remember Mom's necklace? The one she used to wear all the time? Daniel frowned. The music one. Yeah, I remember. Why? I think I saw something today that looked just like it, she said carefully. Not wanting to alarm them, James tilted his head, curiosity lighting his eyes. Where? At the mansion, Lila admitted. in a photo of Mr. Sinclair and some woman. Both boys exchanged a glance. "That's weird," Daniel said. "You think it's connected?" "I don't know," Lila said, her voice quiet. "But I have this feeling." James leaned forward, his tone serious. "Maybe it's worth looking into." That night, Lila lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Memories of her mother flooded her mind. Her warm laughter, her gentle encouragement, and the way she would hum lullabies while wearing that very pendant. The idea of Everett being involved in her family's past unsettled her, but it also filled her with determination. She needed answers. The following day, Lila returned to the mansion with a new sense of purpose. She waited for a moment when Everett was away, and the study was empty. Slipping inside, she retrieved the book and the photograph. This time, she examined it closely, searching for clues. The back of the photo bore a faint handwritten note. Everett and Anna, 1967. Anna. The name sounded vaguely familiar, though Lila couldn't place it. She quickly snapped a picture of the photograph with her phone before returning it to its hiding spot. As she left the study, Mrs. Rodriguez caught her in the hallway. "You've been distracted all morning, mija. What's going on?" Lila hesitated, then decided to confide in her. "I found something strange. A photo of Everett with a woman named Anna. She's wearing a necklace that looks exactly like the one my mom used to have." Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes widened. "That's no coincidence, Lila. You think he knew your family." "I don't know," Lila admitted. "But I need to find out." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded, her expression firm. "Be careful. That man doesn't like anyone digging into his past." Over the next few days, Lila started piecing together fragments of information. She searched through online archives during her breaks, trying to find any connection between Everett and her mother. Her brothers pitched in, helping her comb through old news articles and records. One evening, Daniel's voice broke the silence. "I found something." Lila hurried to his side, her heart racing. Daniel pointed to a scanned article on the screen. It was dated nearly 2 decades earlier and featured a young Everett alongside a woman identified as Anna Sinclair, his late wife. Lila stared at the article, her mind reeling. Could Anna have known her mother, and what had happened to her? Questions swirled in her mind, each one more urgent than the last. The next morning, Lila confronted Mrs. Rodriguez in the kitchen. "Did you ever know Mr. Sinclair's wife?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Mrs. Rodriguez's face softened. "Anna, she was lovely, so different from Everett. Kind, generous, but she passed away a long time ago. Car accident, I think." A chill ran down Lila's spine. Her own mother had died in a car accident. Could there be a connection? "Do you know if she had any connection to music?" Lila asked, her voice betraying her desperation. Mrs. Rodriguez thought for a moment. "I think she did. I remember hearing something about her playing the piano." "Why do you ask?" Lila shook her head. "No reason. Just curious." But inside, her resolve hardened. There was more to this story, and she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. The discovery of Anna Sinclair's name and her possible connection to music consumed Lila's thoughts over the next few days. Every chore she performed at the mansion felt secondary to the growing mystery. How could Everett's late wife, Anna, and her mother be connected? And why did Anna's necklace look identical to the one her mother had cherished? Lila began to see the mansion not as a place of work, but as a maze of secrets. Every hallway, every ornate room seemed to hold a clue waiting to be unearthed. One afternoon, while cleaning the library, Lila spotted an old wooden box on the top shelf of a bookcase. It was slightly ajar, its polished surface gleaming faintly in the light. Curiosity tugged at her, and she carefully climbed the small stepladder to retrieve it. Inside the box were letters, neatly folded and tied with a faded ribbon. Lila's breath caught as she noticed the stationery bore the initials A.A.S., Anna Sinclair. Glancing around to ensure no one was watching, she tucked the box into her cleaning cart, deciding to examine its contents later. When she finally returned to her modest apartment that evening, Lila locked her bedroom door and opened the box. The letters, written in elegant handwriting, were addressed to Everett. As she read through them, a picture began to emerge. Anna had been deeply involved in the arts, particularly music. She wrote about hosting charity events for struggling musicians, her love for playing the piano, and her dream of creating a foundation to support underprivileged artists. But one letter, dated just a few months before Anna's death, sent a chill down Lila's spine. "Dear Everett, I can't shake the feeling that what we're doing is wrong. Your plans for the future may secure our wealth, but at what cost? These people have families, dreams, lives. One of them, Maria, has been on my mind constantly. She reminds me of myself when I was younger, full of hope and light. I've decided to help her, regardless of what you think. I can't stand by and watch her suffer." Lila's hands trembled as she read the name Maria. Her mother's name, the pieces began to click into place. Anna had known her mother, possibly even helped her. But why? And what had Everett's plans been? Determined to find answers, Lila slipped the letter back into the box. She couldn't confront Everett directly. Not yet. She needed more evidence. More clarity. The next day at the mansion, Lila was working in the grand ballroom when Everett appeared, his usual scowl firmly in place. "Miss Barrett," he barked. "I need the upstairs study cleaned immediately. It's a disaster." "Yes, Mr. Sinclair," Lila replied, keeping her tone neutral. She had perfected the art of masking her true emotions around him. As she ascended the stairs, she noticed the door to Everett's personal study was slightly ajar. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside, her heart pounding. The room was immaculate, far from the disaster Everett had described, but her eyes were drawn to a locked cabinet in the corner that evening. She shared her findings with James and Daniel. "I found letters from Anna Sinclair," she said, spreading them out on the table. "She knew Mom. She even mentioned her by name." James frowned, leaning over the papers. What was she helping Mom with? "I don't know yet," Lila admitted. "But there's something else. Everett had some sort of plan that Anna didn't agree with. It sounds shady." Daniel looked up from one of the letters. "You think Everett had something to do with Mom's accident?" The question hung in the air like a storm cloud. Lila's gut told her the answer wasn't simple, but she couldn't dismiss the possibility. Determined to dig deeper, Lila waited for an opportunity to search Everett's study again. The chance came a few days later when Everett left for a business trip, with Mrs. Rodriguez keeping watch. Lila slipped into the study and approached the locked cabinet. Her hands shook as she tried different keys from the set she carried for cleaning purposes. Finally, one clicked. Inside, she found a stack of documents, each stamped with the Sinclair Enterprises logo. As she sifted through them, her eyes landed on a file titled Property Acquisitions, Southside Redevelopment Project. Her heart raced as she flipped through the pages. The documents detailed a plan to purchase and demolish properties in her old neighborhood, including her childhood home, to make way for luxury developments. One memo, dated just weeks before her mother's death, outlined Anna's objections to the project. She had insisted on compensating the displaced families fairly, while Everett had pushed to cut costs by any means necessary. Lila's breath quickened as she pieced it together. Anna had tried to intervene, to protect families like hers from being uprooted, and Everett, blinded by greed, had ignored her pleas. Her mother's accident. Could it have been tied to this? When Everett returned the following morning, Lila couldn't meet his gaze. The weight of what she had discovered pressed heavily on her chest. She knew she needed to act, but every step forward felt like walking a tightrope. If she exposed him, would anyone believe her? And what price would she pay for the truth? As she scrubbed the marble floors, her mind raced with possibilities. Michael had once told her that her voice could make people listen. Maybe it was time to use it. Not just to sing, but to speak the truth. That night, back at her apartment, she made a decision. She would confront Everett, but not in private. She needed witnesses, a platform. The showcase had taught her the power of an audience. If Everett had hidden behind wealth and influence for years, she would pull back the curtain for all to see. "This ends now," she whispered to herself, her resolve hardening. No more secrets. Lila spent the next day walking a tightrope of determination and anxiety. Each step she took inside the mansion felt heavier, the weight of her discovery pressing down on her. Everett's cold commands and sharp glances only added to her resolve. She knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. By the time her shift ended, Lila had made up her mind. She would confront Everett publicly, using her voice to expose the truth about his past. But the question remained: how? She couldn't simply announce it during her work hours without consequences. She needed a platform, one where Everett couldn't easily silence her. That evening, as Lila walked into her apartment, her brothers immediately sensed her unease. James set aside his textbook, and Daniel muted the television. "What's wrong?" James asked. "I found something," Lila began, pulling the copies of Everett's documents from her bag. Everett's company was behind a redevelopment project in our old neighborhood. They planned to buy out families and force them to leave without fair compensation. James frowned. And Mom, Anna Sinclair, his wife, tried to stop him. She mentioned Mom by name in her letters. She knew Mom was one of the families being displaced, Lila explained, her voice trembling. But Everett ignored her, and then, just weeks later, Mom was gone. Daniel sat back, his face pale. "You think the accident wasn't an accident?" "I don't know," Lila admitted, her hands shaking as she spread the documents across the table. "But it wasn't just bad luck. Everett's greed put her in that position. If he hadn't pushed his plans, she might still be alive." James ran a hand through his hair. "So, what are you going to do?" Lila took a deep breath, her determination solidifying. "I'm going to confront him, but not alone. He's too powerful to go up against in private. I need people to hear the truth." Daniel's eyes lit up. "Your next performance." "What?" Lila asked, startled. "The showcase," Daniel continued. "You said Michael wanted you to perform again soon, right? Do it there. Use the stage. People will listen." James nodded. "He's right. If you call him out in front of an audience, he won't be able to hide." Lila hesitated. The idea was bold, risky even, but it also felt right. Her voice had always been her greatest weapon, and now it would be her shield as well. The following day, Lila met with Michael to discuss her upcoming showcase. As they sat in his studio, surrounded by the soft hum of equipment and the faint scent of coffee, she broached the subject carefully. "Michael, I need to talk to you about my next performance," she began. "Of course," he said, leaning forward. "What's on your mind?" "I want to use it to tell a story," she said cautiously. "Not just through music, but with words. There's something I need to share." Michael studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "You're talking about something personal." "Yes," Lila admitted. "It's connected to my past, and to someone very powerful." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Lila, if this is what you feel you need to do, I'll support you. Just know it won't be easy. The truth has a way of making enemies." "I know," she said, her voice firm, "but it's worth the risk." The days leading up to the performance were a blur of rehearsals and quiet moments of reflection. Lila poured her emotions into her music, preparing to channel her pain and strength into every note. At the same time, she carefully planned her speech, ensuring that her words would be clear, impactful, and impossible to ignore. At the mansion, Everett's behavior grew increasingly erratic, whether he sensed her growing defiance or was simply consumed by his own paranoia. He became more critical, assigning her menial tasks and berating her in front of the staff. Yet, for the first time, his words didn't sting. Lila knew his reign over her was nearing its end. The night of the showcase arrived. The venue buzzed with anticipation. The audience a mix of industry professionals, music lovers, and influential figures. Lila stood backstage, her heart pounding as she gripped the microphone. Michael approached, offering her a reassuring smile. "You've got this," he said. "Just be yourself." Lila nodded, taking a deep breath. As her name was announced, she stepped onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding her. The applause washed over her. Steadying her nerves, she began with a song, her voice rich and haunting as it filled the room. The audience was captivated, their attention unwavering. As the final note faded into silence, Lila lowered the microphone, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Music has always been my way of expressing the things I can't say out loud. But tonight, I need to say something." The audience leaned forward, their curiosity palpable. "Many of you know me as a singer," she continued. "But before this, I was just a girl from Chicago, trying to survive. My mother raised me and my brothers on her own. She was strong, kind, and brave, but she was taken from us far too soon." Lila paused, her voice tightening with emotion. Her death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a consequence of greed, Greed from someone who thought their wealth gave them the right to destroy lives. Someone who thought people like us didn't matter. The room was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. "That person is Everett Sinclair," she said, her voice ringing out like a bell. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "The man who employed me, who tried to silence me, is the same man whose actions led to my mother's death." Lila's hands gripped the microphone as she continued. "I have the proof, letters, documents, everything to show how his greed cost not just my family, but countless others." The crowd erupted in murmurs, shock and outrage spreading like wildfire. Lila stood tall, her heart racing but her spirit unshaken. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. The room erupted in chaos. Gasps and murmurs spread like a ripple through the audience, the weight of Lila's accusation hanging heavily in the air. For a moment, she stood frozen, her chest rising and falling with the effort of steadying her breath. Then, the whispers turned into a wave of hushed conversations. Some shocked, others skeptical. Michael, standing backstage, stared at her with a mix of pride and concern. She had taken the risk he'd warned her about, and now they both had to face the consequences. Lila scanned the audience, her gaze locking briefly with Everett Sinclair's unmistakable figure near the back of the room. His jaw was set, his eyes burning with a fury she had expected but still feared. He leaned over to whisper something to the man beside him before making a calculated move toward the exit. "No," Lila said into the microphone, her voice cutting through the crowd. "Don't walk away, Mr. Sinclair. Not this time." The audience quieted. Turning to look at Everett, whose movement halted, he glanced around, realizing that all eyes were now on him. Slowly, he turned back toward the stage, his expression cold and unreadable. "This is your chance," Lila continued, her voice trembling but resolute. "Your chance to face the truth, to acknowledge what you've done. I'm not afraid of you anymore." The room held its collective breath as Everett stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. The spotlight seemed to catch every shadow on his face, accentuating the storm behind his carefully constructed facade. "Miss Barrett," he began, his voice smooth but laced with venom. "This performance of yours is quite the spectacle, but let's not confuse theatrics with facts." Lila's grip on the microphone tightened. "The facts are clear, Mr. Sinclair. I have your wife's letters. I have the documents detailing your plans to destroy my old neighborhood. And I have the courage to stand here and tell the world what you did." The crowd stirred again, the tension in the room thickening. Reporters among the audience began typing furiously, their cameras clicking as they captured the unfolding drama. Everett's smirk faltered for the briefest of moments. "You're mistaken," he said, his tone icier now. "Whatever letters or documents you claim to have are misinterpretations of business decisions. Decisions made years ago. Decisions that cost people their homes, their livelihoods. And in my case, my mother's life." Lila shot back, her voice rising. "Anna Sinclair tried to stop you. She saw the destruction you were causing and stood up for people like us. You ignored her. And when she fought back, she paid the price." Gasps echoed across the room. Everett's face darkened, his composure slipping. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know more than you think," Lila said, her voice steady now. "I know my mother was one of the people Anna was trying to protect. I know your greed drove you to destroy lives for profit. And I know Anna's death wasn't an accident." The final statement hung in the air like a thunderclap. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, a voice from the audience broke the silence. "Is this true, Sinclair?" Another followed. "What about the letters? Are they real?" Everett's gaze flickered between the crowd and Lila, the cracks in his carefully curated image becoming more apparent with each passing second. "This is a baseless attack," he said, his voice tight. "Nothing more than a bitter former employee seeking attention." "Then let's see the evidence," Michael interjected. Stepping forward from backstage, he held up a folder containing the documents and letters Lila had collected. "If these accusations are so unfounded, surely you'd have no problem addressing them." The crowd buzzed with renewed energy. Everett's eyes darted to the folder, then back to Lila for the first time. He seemed genuinely cornered. "You think you can ruin me," he hissed, stepping closer to the stage. "You think your little sob story will make anyone care. I don't have to ruin you," Lila replied, her voice calm but resolute. "You've already done that yourself. I'm just making sure people see the truth." As the tension mounted, security personnel appeared, flanking Everett. One of the event organizers whispered to Michael, gesturing toward the growing media presence in the room. The story was out, and there was no containing it now. Everett straightened, his composure slipping back into place like a mask. "This isn't over," he said coldly. Before turning and leaving the venue, the crowd erupted into a mix of applause and murmurs as the door closed behind him. Lila stepped back from the microphone, her chest heaving. She had done it. The truth was out. Backstage, Michael approached her, his expression a mix of admiration and concern. "Lila, that was bold. It had to be," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I couldn't stay silent anymore." He nodded. "You've started something big tonight. Just be ready for everything." That night, as Lila walked home, the weight of the evening began to settle on her shoulders. The adrenaline that had carried her through the performance was fading, replaced by a deep exhaustion. She knew this was only the beginning. Everett wouldn't go down without a fight, but she was prepared to face whatever came next. Her brothers greeted her at the door, their faces alight with pride. "We watched the live stream," James said, pulling her into a hug. "You were incredible." "Yeah," Daniel added. "You stood up to him. For Mom. For all of us." Lila smiled, the warmth of their support grounding her. "It's not over yet," she said, "but we've taken the first step." As she sat down at the kitchen table, the reality of what she had done began to sink in. She had challenged one of the most powerful men she had ever known, not with money or influence, but with the truth. And for the first time in years, she felt free. The fallout from Lila's revelation was immediate and far-reaching. By the next morning, her confrontation with Everett had gone viral. Clips of her calling out his greed and exposing his connection to her mother's death were circulating across social media. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a battle between a fearless artist and a powerful businessman. Lila sat in her small living room, scrolling through the endless stream of headlines on her phone. Words like courageous and relentless were being used to describe her, but mixed among the praise were skeptics and critics. Questioning her motives and the validity of her claims, James sat beside her, scanning the comments. "Don't pay attention to the trolls," he said, his tone protective. "They're just bitter people who hate seeing someone stand up to power." Daniel, seated on the floor, nodded. "Most people believe you, Eve. And the ones who don't? They will, once they see the evidence." Lila managed a small smile, their support anchoring her in the midst of the storm. "Thanks, guys. I just didn't expect it to blow up this fast." Meanwhile, at the Sinclair mansion, the atmosphere was tense. Everett had returned from the showcase seething, slamming doors and barking orders at anyone who dared to approach him. His legal team had been working through the night, preparing statements to counter the allegations. By midday, a press conference was held on the steps of Sinclair Enterprises. Everett stood before a sea of reporters, his expression calculated and composed. "These baseless accusations," he began, his voice smooth and measured, "are nothing more than a smear campaign by an embittered former employee. Miss Barrett's claims lack any factual foundation, and I fully intend to pursue legal action against her for defamation." Questions erupted from the crowd. "Oh," but Everett raised a hand to silence them. "The truth will prevail," he concluded, before turning and walking away without taking further questions. Back at home, Lila watched the press conference unfold on her phone, her stomach tightening with unease. She had expected Everett to fight back, but seeing him dismiss her so effortlessly stung. "He's bluffing," James said firmly. "He knows you have the proof." "Then why does it feel like I'm already losing?" Lila murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel looked up at her, his eyes serious. "Because you're scared, and that's normal. But you've come this far, Lila. You can't back down now." As the days passed, the scrutiny intensified. Reporters camped outside the mansion and Lila's apartment, desperate for a comment. Michael worked tirelessly to manage the media frenzy, scheduling interviews and organizing press releases to support her narrative. But as supportive as he was, the pressure was unrelenting. During one of their meetings, Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Lila, I know this is overwhelming, but you've already done the hardest part. You've told your truth. Now let the world see the evidence. She nodded, her resolve strengthening. You're right, it's time. A week later, Lila held her own press conference, organized with Michael's help. The venue was modest compared to Sinclair Enterprises, but the room was packed with reporters and supporters. Lila stood behind a simple podium, the folder of documents in her hands. Good evening, she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. A week ago, I shared a story. My story, tonight. I'm here to share the evidence. She held up one of Anna's letters, the stationery's elegant handwriting visible to the cameras. This is a letter from Anna Sinclair, Everett Sinclair's late wife. In it, she expresses her concerns about his business practices. Specifically regarding a redevelopment project in my old neighborhood, she names my mother, Maria, as one of the people she was trying to protect. Lila flipped through the documents, showing scans of contracts and memos signed by Everett. These documents outline his plans to displace families, offering them little to no compensation for their homes. My mother was one of those families. She paused, her voice growing heavier. Weeks after Anna wrote this letter, my mother died in what was reported as a car accident. But what I've uncovered shows that her death wasn't just a tragic coincidence. It was the direct result of the pressure Everett's actions placed on our community. The room was silent as Lila's words sank in. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the documents back on the podium. This isn't just about me or my family. It's about holding people accountable no matter how powerful they are. As she stepped back from the podium, applause erupted, mingled with the flashes of cameras. Lila felt a wave of relief and exhaustion wash over her. She had done what she set out to do. The next day, headlines began to shift. Reporters dug deeper into Sinclair Enterprises' history, uncovering additional instances of questionable practices. Former employees and business partners came forward, corroborating parts of Lila's story. The tide was turning, and Everett's carefully constructed empire was beginning to crack. At the mansion, Mrs. Rodriguez pulled Lila aside as she collected her things after her shift. "You're brave, mija," the older woman said, her voice full of pride. "Not many people would stand up to someone like him." Lila smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without people like you supporting me." Mrs. Rodriguez patted her shoulder. "He's scared, you know. That's why he's fighting so hard." "I hope he is," Lila replied, "because I'm not stopping until the truth is out." That evening, as Lila walked home, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. The battle wasn't over, but she had taken a stand, and the world was listening. For the first time, she felt truly free to chase her dreams, free to honor her mother's memory, and free to live without fear. The weeks following Lila's press conference marked a turning point. Media coverage shifted sharply against Everett Sinclair, as investigative reporters unearthed more damning evidence of his unethical business practices. Former employees came forward, sharing stories of intimidation and greed that mirrored Lila's claims. Social media buzzed with hashtags like Justice for Maria and Saw Sinclair Exposed, turning Lila into a symbol of resilience and truth. But the fight wasn't without cost. Paparazzi swarmed Lila's apartment daily, snapping photos of her as she came and went. Online trolls targeted her, spreading misinformation and questioning her motives. Michael worked tirelessly to manage the fallout. But the sheer volume of attention was overwhelming. "You've become the face of a movement," Michael told her during a meeting at his office. "That's a double-edged sword. It gives you power, but it also makes you a target." "I'm not backing down," Lila said firmly. "Not after everything that's happened." Michael smiled, admiration in his eyes. "Good, because the world needs people like you." At the Sinclair mansion, Everett's once unshakable demeanor had begun to falter. His pristine reputation was in tatters, his business deals unraveling as clients distanced themselves from the growing scandal behind closed doors. He lashed out at his staff, firing several longtime employees and tightening his grip on the company's operations. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had managed to stay under the radar, watched the chaos unfold with quiet satisfaction. "That man is finally getting what he deserves," she whispered to Lila one afternoon. But be careful, mija. Desperate people are dangerous." Lila nodded, her resolve unshaken. "I'm ready for whatever comes next." A pivotal moment came when Lila received a call from a high-profile investigative journalist, Clara Reyes. Clara, known for her fearless reporting, had been following the Sinclair story closely and wanted to interview Lila for a feature piece. "This could be huge," Michael said when Lila told him. "Clara's work has brought down entire corporations. If she's on your side, Sinclair doesn't stand a chance." Lila hesitated. "Do you think I'm ready for something like this?" "You've been ready since the moment you stepped on that stage," Michael said, his voice full of conviction. "This is your story, Lila. Tell it." The interview took place in a quiet cafe away from the media frenzy. Clara, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, greeted Lila warmly but wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. "Lila, your story has captivated millions," Clara began, her recorder placed discreetly on the table. "But it's also stirred up controversy. What do you say to those who claim this is about revenge or publicity?" Lila took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "This was never about revenge. It's about accountability. My mother was a victim of a system that values profits over people. All I want is for the truth to come out, so no one else has to go through what we did." Clara nodded, clearly impressed. "And Everett Sinclair, if he were sitting here right now, what would you say to him?" Lila's jaw tightened. "I'd ask him if it was worth it. All the money, the power. Was it worth the lives he destroyed?" The interview continued for nearly an hour, with Clara asking pointed questions and Lila answering with unwavering honesty. When it was over, Clara shook her hand firmly. "You're brave, Lila. Keep going." A week later, Clara's article was published, and it hit like a bombshell, titled, "The Sins of Sinclair, a Legacy of Greed and Loss." It painted a damning picture of Everett's empire. Weaving Lila's personal story with testimonies from other victims, the article went viral almost immediately, sparking protests outside Sinclair Enterprises and calls for a full investigation into the company's practices. Everett, for his part, doubled down on his defense. He appeared on a major news network, his polished suit and measured tone a stark contrast to the storm surrounding him. "These allegations are unfounded," he insisted. "I've built my career on integrity and hard work. Miss Barrett's claims are baseless, and I look forward to clearing my name." But the cracks in his armor were visible. His eyes darted nervously, and his confident facade seemed strained. Meanwhile, Lila's life took another unexpected turn. Her brothers, James and Daniel, had been quietly working on a project of their own, a tribute to their mother. They presented it to Lila one evening, a simple but moving video that combined old family photos with footage of Lila's performances and news coverage of her fight for justice. "This is amazing," Lila said, tears welling up as she watched the video. "I can't believe you two put this together. We wanted people to see the real story," James said. "Who Mom was, who you are." "Yeah," Daniel added. "The world should know why you're doing this." They posted the video online, and within hours, it had gone viral. People from around the world shared it, expressing their support and admiration for Lila's courage. As the pressure mounted, Everett's empire began to crumble. Several board members resigned, distancing themselves from the scandal. Investigators launched inquiries into Sinclair Enterprises' finances and operations. Uncovering years of shady deals and unethical practices, Lila, watching the news from her living room, felt a mix of relief and sadness. The fight was taking its toll on everyone involved, but justice felt closer than ever. "You've done it," Michael said over the phone that evening. "You've brought down a giant." "Not yet," Lila replied. "But we're getting there." The battle was far from over, but for the first time Lila felt the scales beginning to tip. The truth, long buried under wealth and power, was finally seeing the light of day, and she was ready for whatever came next. The news was relentless. Every major outlet covered the downfall of Everett Sinclair and the unraveling of his empire. Investigations unearthed damning details about his business practices, displaced families, fraudulent deals, and calculated exploitation of communities. What had started with Lila's confrontation had snowballed into a reckoning Sinclair couldn't escape. Sinclair Enterprises' stock plummeted, and protesters gathered daily outside the company's headquarters. Former allies turned against Everett, distancing themselves from the growing scandal. Even within the mansion, the air was heavy with tension. Staff avoided him, whispers of his looming downfall circulating like wildfire. Lila, meanwhile, found herself at the center of a movement she hadn't anticipated. She was no longer just the girl with a powerful voice. She was a symbol of resistance, of speaking truth to power. Media requests poured in, and her social media following exploded. But the newfound fame was exhausting. Every interview, every comment felt like a reminder of the weight she now carried. "You're doing incredible things, Lila," Michael said during a quiet moment in his office. "But you need to take care of yourself too." "I'm fine," Lila replied, though her tired eyes betrayed her. "You've been fighting non-stop," Michael pressed. "Don't burn yourself out. The fight will still be here tomorrow." Lila nodded, though the thought of slowing down felt impossible. So much was at stake, and the momentum was too important to lose. Back at the mansion, Mrs. Rodriguez continued to offer quiet support. "You're making waves, Misha," she said one afternoon as they worked side by side in the kitchen. "But be careful. Everett's pride is wounded, and a man like him won't go down without a fight." "I know," Lila said, her voice steady, "but I'm not afraid of him anymore." Mrs. Rodriguez smiled faintly. "That's what scares him the most." The breaking point came during an emergency board meeting at Sinclair Enterprises. Everett had been summoned to address the growing unrest among his investors. Inside the sleek conference room, his once loyal associates grilled him relentlessly. "We're hemorrhaging money, Everett," one board member snapped. "Our reputation is in ruins. What are you doing to fix this?" "This is a smear campaign," Everett replied, his tone icy. "We'll recover once the truth comes out." Another board member shook his head. "The truth is out, Sinclair, and it's ugly." As the meeting continued, Everett's defenses crumbled. By the end, a vote was called, and the decision was unanimous. Everett Sinclair was removed as CEO of Sinclair Enterprises. He stormed out of the building, his carefully constructed world in shambles. The news broke that evening, and Lila watched the broadcast with a mix of emotions. Everett's removal was a victory, but it didn't feel like the end. There was still so much left unresolved. Her brothers joined her in the living room, their expressions hopeful. "You did it," James said, his voice full of pride. "He's done." "Maybe," Lila said, her gaze fixed on the screen. "But this fight was never just about him. It's about making sure people like him can't do this again." Daniel nodded. "And you've already started that change." Later that night, Lila sat alone at the kitchen table, sifting through the documents and letters that had brought her to this point. Among them was the photo of Anna Sinclair wearing the treble clef necklace. Lila traced the edges of the image with her finger, wondering how much Anna had sacrificed to stand up to Everett. "You did what you could," Lila whispered to the photo. "And now it's my turn." The next morning, Lila received an unexpected message from Clara Reyes, the journalist who had interviewed her. "Meet me at the cafe," it read. "I've uncovered something you need to see." Intrigued and nervous, Lila arrived at the cafe, where Clara was already seated with a folder on the table. "Lila," Clara said, gesturing for her to sit. "I've been digging deeper into Anna Sinclair's death, and I found something." Lila's heart raced as Clara opened the folder. Inside were copies of police reports, witness statements, and a coroner's report from the night of Anna's fatal accident. "This doesn't add up," Clara explained. "The reports are contradictory, and one of the witnesses changed their story." "What are you saying?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying Anna's death might not have been an accident," Clara replied, her tone grave. "It's possible someone wanted her silenced." The revelation hit Lila like a tidal wave. If Anna had been silenced for opposing Everett, how far had he gone to protect his empire? And what did this mean for her mother's death? The thought consumed her as she walked home that evening. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover, more truths to bring to light. Everett might have been removed from his position, but the shadows of his actions still loomed large. As Lila reached her apartment, she turned to look at the city skyline. The lights flickered in the distance, a reminder of how far she had come and how much further she had to go. "This isn't over," she murmured to herself, a spark of determination igniting within her. Not yet. The revelation from Clara lingered in Lila's mind, a weight she couldn't ignore. If Anna Sinclair's death had been orchestrated, the implications were staggering. And if Everett had been involved, how far had his web of deceit and greed stretched? Lila knew she couldn't rest until she uncovered the full truth. The following morning, she met Clara at a small office rented by the journalist for her investigative work. The walls were covered in pinned documents, photographs, and timelines, a web of connections that Clara had meticulously pieced together. "I've been following Everett Sinclair for years," Clara began, gesturing toward the chaotic collage. "But it wasn't until you came forward that I had enough to dig deeper. Anna's death, your mother's accident. It's all connected." Lila's stomach tightened. "How?" Clara handed her a folder. Inside were transcripts of interviews with former employees of Sinclair Enterprises, whistleblowers who had come forward in the wake of the scandal. Many described a pattern of intimidation, cover-ups, and calculated moves to silence dissent. One of these witnesses worked closely with Everett during the Southside redevelopment project, Clara explained. He claims that Anna discovered some of the more unethical practices and threatened to expose them. Lila's breath caught. "And that's why she was killed," Clara hesitated. "I can't prove that directly, but the timing is suspicious. Just days before her accident, Anna was planning to go public, then suddenly she's gone, and Everett benefits from her silence." Lila spent the next several days poring over the evidence with Clara's help. Each new piece added to the puzzle, painting a chilling picture of Everett's ruthlessness. Her anger grew with every discovery, fueled by the knowledge that her mother's death had likely been another casualty of his greed. Michael, ever her steady supporter, urged caution. "You're walking a dangerous line. Lila, if you go after him with this, you need to be absolutely certain." "I know," Lila replied, her resolve unshaken. "But if I don't, who will?" The moment of truth came during a live broadcast organized by Clara's network. Lila had agreed to sit for a second interview, this time with the new evidence laid out for the world to see. Clara introduced her with measured seriousness, recounting the journey that had brought them to this point. "Tonight, Lila Barrett will share what she's uncovered," Clara said, turning to face her. "Lila, you've become a symbol of accountability in the face of power. What do you want people to know?" Lila took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I want people to know that no one is above the truth. Not Everett Sinclair, not anyone." She presented the documents Clara had helped her compile, outlining the chain of events that linked Everett to Anna's death, and the redevelopment project that had cost her mother her life. Her voice was steady, her words measured, but the emotion behind them was undeniable. "I've spent my entire life wondering why my mother was taken from us," Lila said, her voice cracking slightly. "Now I know. It wasn't just an accident. It was the result of greed, of someone who valued money more than human lives." The audience was silent. Captivated by her courage, Clara guided the conversation, probing deeper into the evidence and allowing Lila to share the full scope of her story. As the broadcast ended, the response was immediate. Social media erupted with calls for justice, and Sinclair Enterprises faced renewed scrutiny. Investigations into Anna's death were reopened, and Everett's name became synonymous with corruption and greed. Back at her apartment, Lila sat with her brothers, the weight of the evening settling over her. "You did it," James said, his voice filled with awe. "You finally told the world." Daniel nodded, a small smile on his face. "Mom would be so proud." Lila blinked back tears, the gravity of their words sinking in. She had carried her mother's memory like a shield, and now she felt she had honored it in the best way she could. The next morning, Lila received an unexpected call from an anonymous number. She hesitated before answering, her heart pounding in anticipation. "Miss Barrett," the voice on the other end said, smooth and calculated. "This is Everett Sinclair." Lila froze, the familiar chill of his presence settling over her. "What do you want?" "I'd like to meet," Everett said, his tone devoid of its usual arrogance. "There are things we need to discuss. After everything you've done, you think I'd meet with you," Lila replied, her voice sharp. "I'm offering you the truth," Everett said, "but only if you're willing to listen." Against her better judgment, Lila agreed to meet him in a public space, a small cafe near the city center. Everett arrived alone, his polished exterior marred by the strain of recent events. He sat across from her, his gaze heavy. "You've made quite the enemy of me," he began, his voice low. "But you've also forced me to confront things I've spent years burying." Lila crossed her arms. "I'm not interested in your excuses." "It's not an excuse," he said. Leaning forward, "It's an admission. Anna was right. I was greedy, reckless, and blind to the damage I caused. And your mother, Maria, she was one of the few people brave enough to stand up to me." Lila's breath caught. "Then why did she die?" Everett's face darkened. "Because I didn't stop the forces I set in motion. I didn't care enough to see the consequences, but I didn't kill her. Not directly." Lila stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind of anger and confusion. "You let it happen." "Yes," he admitted, his voice barely audible, "and I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my life." When Lila left the cafe, she felt a strange sense of closure. Everett's admission didn't absolve him, but it brought her a measure of peace. She had fought for the truth, and now it was out in the open. As she walked home, the city lights blurred in her vision. She thought of her mother, of Anna, and of the people who had supported her along the way. Her fight had been for them, and for herself. And though the battle was over, her story was just beginning.